print them. And so Ouma is this guy over here. And these are the latest photos from Ghana, right? Yeah. So I'll screen them again. Often when I talk to my students about African writers, I try to bring them into the classroom, either by way of videos or sometimes we talk about, in literary studies, there was a period where critics came up with this idea of the death of the author. And these were really critics who were interested in the text, and they were not interested in context. And they were interested in the form of the text and what the text, whether it's a novel or a play or a poem, what it does. And for them, the author didn't quite count. But I think over the years, other forms of criticism have kind of come up, and contexts and biographical contexts become important whenever we read text. So I always insist to my students that you cannot extricate a text from its conditions of production. And so one has to consider the time of the text, the time of the author, what are some of the value judgments that one can put on a text that are three-dimensional if you consider all of those things. So this is why I like, bringing photographs and videos into the classroom. Sometimes it's important to let the author talk, or, So thank you for these photos. Just to pick up from some of the concerns that I raised yesterday, you'll notice that if you've read both texts, A Grain of Wheat and The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, you'll notice that they're similar concerns for both Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Ouma. They're both trying to grapple with this moment of independence. They're both trying to grapple with the expectations of this independence, albeit in different ways. A Grain of Wheat focuses on the period just before independence and the doubts that are beginning to creep in into that project of independence. Ouma's The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born dives in straight into the disillusionment of independence in the first decade of Ghana's independence between 1957 and 1967. And so Ouma's The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born digs into even more deeper philosophical questions around freedom and choice. The idea of independence came with the promise of freedom, and therefore the promise of more choices for the people who were previously colonized. But of course, those choices and that freedom immediately came under question for various reasons. I always remember the one interview that Chinua Achebe gave in the 80s when somebody was asking him, why are many African countries corrupt? Why are political practices in the continent, why are they corrupt? And one of the reasons he gave, which was quite interesting, he said that obviously there's a sense of agency on the part of people who occupy political positions, and they must be held into account. But one of the things he said that was interesting was that the system of colonialism did not prepare anyone to be democratic, and the people who took over, without saying that they have to take the blame for some of their own, that they don't have to take the blame for some of their own practices, that indeed they inherited a system that was not going to allow for any kind of democracy. It was a system that worked with patronage. It was a system that was designed to create dependencies, and it was upon them anyway to try and break those dependencies. And many of these writers that I'm talking about, we're calling the first generation of African writers, considered themselves radicals at the time. And for them, independence meant a relatively radical break from practices of colonialism, which meant that the leaders who took over needed to begin to focus on the larger, lower socioeconomic classes. And for them, it was building institutions that were going to benefit many of the people who were previously marginalized and who were not part of the emerging middle class in many of these countries. And this is why I assume that after the Second World War and the rise of the Cold War at the time, left-thinking radical ideas were very much part of the daily reality of people at the time. And so that's why someone like Ngugi ends up embracing Marxism. And you can see that people like Ouma consider themselves radical. They consider themselves as people who think about the everyday man and woman in the street, other than the political classes who've inherited some kind of privilege from former colonial masters. And so Ouma and Ngugi can come into this conversation in different ways. And if you start reading The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, you'll see that one of the first reactions that I had as a student when I first read this novel, obviously there was a lot of kind of excremental imagery, and there's despair, and everything is lost and gone. When you read through the novel, there's something of a very dark future for this country, and you wonder, where is that hope going to come from? I don't know what your experience has been in reading the novel. But interestingly, within the novel itself, it's a project of regeneration, in fact. That in fact, if you look at how the man, this guy who's characterized as the man, how he thinks about freedom and choice against the corruption and the failure of decolonization, it's a deeply ethical and moral project of regeneration. So it will be interesting to balance your immediate apprehension of the text when you read it and other interpretations that might allow you to see an actual project of regeneration that is going on. But I'm going to touch on that in a moment. I just want to start with the project of independence that Ngugi, in A Grain of Wheat, was trying to grapple with at the moment of the Union Jack going down and the Kenyan flag going up. And there's a passage that I'd like to read here that I assume is going to set us on a path, on the part of Ouma, of questions of freedom and choice and some of the simmering concerns and anxieties about freedom. And so in A Grain of Wheat, in chapter 14, the first two paragraphs, Kenya gained her uhuru from the British on the 12th of December 1963. A minute before midnight, lights were put out at the Nairobi Stadium so that people from all over the country and the world who had gathered there for the midnight ceremony were swallowed by the darkness. In the dark, the Union Jack was quickly lowered. When next the lights came on, the new Kenya flag was flying and fluttering and waving in the air. The police band played the new national anthem, and the crowd cheered continuously when they saw the flag was black and red and green. The cheering sounded like one intense cracking of many trees falling on the thick mud in the stadium. In our village, and despite the drizzling rain, men and women and children, it seemed, had emptied themselves into the streets, where they sang and danced in the mud. Because it was dark, they put oil lamps at the doorsteps to light the streets. As usual, on such occasions, some young men walked in gangs, carrying torches, laughed and whispered in dark corners and the fringes, really looking for love mates among the crowd. Mothers warned their daughters to take care not to be raped in the dark. The girls danced in the middle, thrusting out their buttocks provokingly, knowing that the men in corners watched them. Everybody waited for something to happen. This waiting, which is put in quotes, waiting, and the uncertainty that went with it, like a woman torn between fear and joy during birth motions, was a taut chord beneath the screams and the shouts and the laughter. And this is, I think this paragraph puts a lot of things in perspective. Uncertainty, the waiting, the anxiety that is simmering on the ground. And I think as readers, this moment, which comes towards the end of the novel, has been building up with the character Mugo. When we take ourselves through the journey in Mugo's mind throughout the novel, this is exactly what is ominous and is waiting to happen. There's something bubbling under the surface. And this uncertainty and the waiting comes with a kind of existential crisis that is about to unfold about freedom. What does freedom entail apart from accumulation, apart from inheriting positions, apart from, and these are the deep philosophical questions that are at play in The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. And I think that Ouma continues this project in the first decade of independence. So I wanted to flag this out just to make the connection between the two texts. But I'm going to touch on that, and I'm going to play a video of Ghana's independence. And I'd like you to listen very carefully to what Kwame Nkrumah says when he acknowledges all the people who for him, are part of this project of independence. It would be interesting for you to think about all the people he mentions. But, so, and of course the title, Great Expectations, and it should be the morning, sorry. I think this is actually meant, yeah, I think that's what I meant. Okay. Yeah, just a few photos of Oumas as a young man and as a much older writer. And there are obviously different editions of The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. I don't know which one you've got access to. Now, and again, I always go back to drawing context, so to see where many of these writers are coming from. He was born in 1938 in Ghana. He was educated in Ghana and in the US. He went to Harvard, I think at Columbia, studied sociology. And as many other African writers, they ended up becoming translators and teachers and editors and lecturers. They took on a whole range of professional activities. If you think about South Africa's Solomon Plaatje, if you think about the first generation of black intellectuals in South Africa, they took on a whole range of roles. Someone like Plaatje was a translator, he was a court interpreter, he started all sorts of vernacular newspapers in the country. And many of these writers saw themselves as part of a vanguard generation that was going to create institutions and think very carefully about national literatures, institutions that are going to champion and articulate and create conditions for the possibility of national literatures. And of course, many of them soon afterwards became really disappointed. Oumas published his first 5 novels with the African Writers series. I'm using the acronym AWS. I don't know if you know about the African Writers series. For those who don't know, for the benefit of those who don't know, I'm just going to. So the African Writers series was a book series that was founded by James Curry, Kit Sambrook, and Chinua Achebe in the late 50s. And it was specifically meant to source and publish stories from the continent. It came out of Heinemann, the publisher, and they came up with what they call Heinemann Educational Publisher Series, and the African Writer Series was one of the series in the publisher's house. And I just want to, as you can see there, then quite a few novels and plays and collections of poetry, quite a number of African writers, as you can see there. South African, well, North, East, West, and Southern Africa. And if you can get your hands on any of these, and there's a lot out there, as you can see. So people like Oumas, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Chinua Achebe, Buchi Emecheta, who we're going to talk about tomorrow, were some of the first writers to begin contributing to this series. I think the UCT library has, as I pointed out yesterday, has a database, an online database with many of these novels, many of these texts. So you can just go to the library database and source them out. So Oumas published 5 novels in this series. And what is interesting is that after he published 5 novels in this series, he felt that the audience he was reaching out to, just like Ngugi, he felt that the audience he was reaching out to was more of a metropolitan, more of a Western audience. And he felt that his novels were not circulating in Ghana and in the continent. And so he withdrew all the publishing rights from African Writer Series. And he set up his own small publishing house in Senegal. And then he began on a slightly different project from the one that he had in his first 5 novels. You could see inklings of that project in his first 5 novels. With the kind of disappointment that he felt the project of independence brought itself, he became interested in deep historical and archival. He became interested in a longer historical project for the continent. And so he began to embrace Egyptology, studies on Egypt and the origins of civilization in the continent. I don't know if any of you know Cheikh Anta Diop. I'm just going to talk about it now. So anyway, apart from The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, he then authored Fragments, Why Are We So Blessed, 2000 Seasons, and again, 2000 Seasons very much an archaeological literary history, going back 2000 seasons, looking at the history of the continent before colonialism and other forms of colonialism that existed before that. And then Osiris Rising, The Healers Kemet, these are novels about Egyptology. They are novels that go back to the journey of the continent and of modern civilization through Egypt. So he set up on a slightly different project from the kind of despair that he felt the post-colonial moment brought. He felt that the problems or the solutions for the kind of disillusionment that many African countries were experiencing in the first decade of independence could not only be found in their immediate history. He felt that one has to go back and recuperate a much longer history. So many of these other novels are, very much about that. And the interesting thing that he's always keen to try and explore is questions of freedom and choice against the corruption and decay that attended to many African countries at the beginning of their independence. So Ouma sees movements in history as an epic narrative. If you read The Healers, 2000 Seasons, there's something about history as a long durée, if I can use the word, as a kind of a long and archaeological epic. And for him, you cannot recuperate any sense of an ethical or moral project going forward without digging a little bit deeper and farther. Many more seasons, many more centuries before, colonialism. And so, as you obviously know, Kwame Nkrumah was interested in Pan-Africanism. When Ghana got its independence in 1957, one of the things, if you read the longer history of black intellectual thought and of many Africans who were in the mid-19th, late 19th, early 20th century, who were traveling around the world, Ghana became a very important country for particularly the black diaspora in North America and the Caribbean. And so Kwame Nkrumah comes off the project of Pan-Africanism that was set up by people like W.E.B. Du Bois in the US, amongst others, and all the congresses that were happening from 1900. And Ghana was one of the only countries in the continent that held the Pan-African Congress after independence. And so Kwame Nkrumah's project of independence very much built on ideas of a Pan-African project, a kind of a continental identity. So one of the things that he managed to do was to begin focusing on a continental Pan-Africanism as opposed to a global kind of Pan-Africanism. So his focus for him was on the rest of the continent. As many other countries got their independence, how can Africa as a continent begin to think of itself as a collective identity? So he was very much invested in that project. And one of the reasons why he was deposed in a coup was that people in Ghana felt that the project that he was trying to put together was bigger than the country, and it was taking away from the very local concerns of the country itself. And they felt that it's like when you think about contemporary political cultures, when you think about people who've worked in government, if you think about foreign policy, where you're told that some presidents focus more on foreign policy as opposed to. So one of the reasons why people felt Ghana wasn't going forward was that he was out there championing for the continent when they had their own problems. But that's one of many other reasons. So, as I pointed out, Aikwe Ouma was interested in Egyptology. His later novels, like Kemet, very much trying to work on that. And I mentioned Cheikh Anta Diop, who's a very important scholar who studied Egyptology. And one of the key books that he wrote was African Origin of Civilization, just for your own interest. One of the things that Aikwe Ouma also championed for was the adoption of Swahili as a continental language. Yesterday, somebody asked me a question about the language debate, and I pointed out that in the early 60s, many African writers were torn between either writing in European languages or colonial languages, or writing in languages of the continent, or picking up one language that is spoken in many countries in the continent, making it a lingua franca. So Aikwe Ouma was one of the few people who thought that a language like Swahili would work as a kind of a continental lingua franca. Wole Soyinka, I don't know if you know Wole Soyinka, was also one of the champions of that in the language debate. And of course, it's obviously more complicated. The complication obviously comes from questions around audiences, questions around translation, a rising middle class in the continent, the Anglophone economy, which is extremely overdetermining and dominant. So all of those questions then began getting unpacked. But the difference between the language debate in the early 60s and now is obviously that now there's a bigger corpus of African writers. There's a whole discipline of African literature. There's a bigger middle class in the continent. There are institutions that can balance the weight of these different arguments. And so it will be interesting to reflect on the language debate now as opposed to in the early 60s. Right? So if you can indulge me for a moment, I'm going to play this video. It's a little long, so I hope it won't take away from time to focus on the novel itself. Is that too dark?
At long last, the battle has ended. And thus, Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever. And yet again, I want to take the opportunity to thank the chiefs and people of this country, the youth, the farmers, the women, who have so nobly fought and won this battle. Also, I want to thank the valiant ex-servicemen who have so cooperated with me in this mighty task of freeing our country from foreign rule and imperialism. And as I pointed out at our party conference at Sorbonne, I made it quite clear that from now on today, we must change our attitudes, our minds. We must realize that from now on, we are no more a colonial, but a free and independent people. But also, as I pointed out, that also entails hard work. I am depending upon the millions of the country, the chiefs and people, to help me to reshape the destiny of this country. We are prepared to build it up and make it a nation that will be respected by every other nation in the world. We know we are going to have difficult beginnings, but again, I'm relying upon your support. I'm relying upon your hard work. Seeing you in these thousands, it doesn't matter how far my eye goes. I can see that you are here in your millions. And my last warning to you is that you ought to stand firm behind us so that we can prove to the world that when the African is given a chance, he can show to the world that he's somebody. We are waiting. We shall no more go back to sleep anymore. Today, from now on, there is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle and show that after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs. We are going to demonstrate to the world, to the other nations, young as we are, that we are prepared to lay our own foundation. As I said in the assembly just minutes ago, I made it point that we are going to see that we create our own African personality and identity. It's the only way in which we can show the world that we are ready for our own battle. But today, may I call upon you all that at this great day, let us all remember that nothing in the world can be done unless it has the purported support of God. We have done the battle, and we again rededicate ourselves not only in the struggle to emancipate other territories in Africa. Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent. Let us now, fellow Ghanaians, let us now ask for God's blessing. And for only 2 seconds, in your thousands and millions, I want to ask you to pause only for 1 minute and give thanks to Almighty God for having led us through obstacles, difficulties, imprisonments, hardship and suffering to have brought us to the end of our trouble today. 1 minute silence. Ghana is free forever.
I think I'll stop there. So as you can see that the euphoria, the kind of euphoria that attended that moment, and this idea of a continental identity that he had in mind. But if you listen to the speech at first, he thanks everybody, and he says all the chiefs and farmers. And of course, what is interesting is that many of those chiefs collaborated with the British. Many of the chiefs who were part of the system of colonial governance were very much the so-called traitors. And there's a blank slate that seems to attend to this moment, which then begins to expose itself. And if you read A Grain of Wheat again, you'll see that Ngugi is very much kind of fingering those cracks that were about to become the gulfs of war, in fact. By the late 60s, he was deposed. There was a wave of military coups all over the continent. And so the project of independence clearly hadn't been thought through as carefully by the people who took over this power. In fact, if you want to think about, for me, if you're thinking about a history of the continent in the 60s and the 70s, if you want to get the actual structural feeling of that history, you'll have to read the literature, because many of the authors who were publishing at the time, they were coming at this problem of independence from a different angle. And those are the people who are actually fingering the cracks that were happening at that time. I gave you the example of Peter Abrahams, a South African author who left in the 40s, went in exile. He was in Ghana at some point, then ended up in Jamaica, where he is at the moment. He decided he's not going to come back. He's 97. He says he's not going to come back to South Africa. But you can see why. If you read a novel that he wrote called Aredfo Domo in 1958, you can see that he was cautioning against these great expectations. He was cautioning against a rising political class that was going to dominate everything, that was going to accumulate wealth, that was going to not really care about a national project. And many of these, part of this kind of prophetic moments of this prophetic kind of projects that people like Peter Abrahams and Ngugi wa Thiong'o are thinking about very much come from the Caribbean. If you're thinking about a history of the Caribbean, if you think about Haiti, for instance, and you're thinking about the Haitian Revolution in the late 18th century, 1779, and what happened afterwards, the leader of the revolution ended up really failing to kind of create the conditions for a more substantive idea of freedom and choice and economic prosperity for the people of Haiti. So there are already lessons from other continents that people like Peter Abrahams are already aware of. So Ghana was a kind of a melting pot for many of these intellectuals. So they could see the hope, but they were obviously cautious from the history of the Caribbean at the time. So if you're thinking about Jamaica and you're thinking about Eric Williams, who talks about capitalism and slavery and the dynamic that continues to play itself in the continent, then you'll be able to see that there was already intellectual work that was supposed to prepare many African thinkers and leaders better, but obviously it didn't. If we think about South Africa, one of the things that, what is the name of the judge, what's his name? He wrote this important article, Preparing Ourselves for Freedom, Albie Sachs. You remember Albie Sachs? wrote this article called Preparing Ourselves for Freedom, and he was asking a fundamental question about the ANC in government as opposed to the ANC in exile. And he was asking, is this a government coming from exile really prepared? Is it aware of the kind of 30 or 40 years it's been away? Is it really ready to lead the country? And if this government negotiates its deals with the rest of the world, is it negotiating it for the country or for itself? Right? And of course, at the moment, South Africa is going through a really interesting period. And if you're thinking about the South African government and the ANC when it took over, it had come from exile in other parts of the continent, which is quite interesting to think about. What are some of the lessons? What are some of the, that could have been brought to bear on that moment? Quite a few were brought to bear, but obviously the project is unfinished. And so these moments very much speak to, in a very weird temporal way, they speak to South Africa at the moment. Right. And it's interesting to juxtapose these different realities. Moment. So for Aikwe Yama, independence brought the great expectations, and it was seen as losses. The losses that many people suffered during the fight for independence was seen as sacrifice. If you think of a grain of wheat, you think about Kihika, you think about how Kihika is celebrated and the idea of loss and sacrifice as something that is going to bear on the promise of freedom. And the ceremony of independence, as we've just witnessed, was a kind of an idea of reimagining a nation, right? That was the idea. And the expectations were that this idea of nationhood was going to be reimagined. And the independence, the lowering of the Union Jack and the hoisting of the Ghanaian flag or the Kenyan flag was symbolic of a project of reimagining, which obviously for many countries just ended there in that spectacle. Right? And if you read chapter 6 of The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, there's a character called the teacher who talks about, we were ready for big and beautiful things. And I just brought that quote there. We were ready for big and beautiful things. Obviously, one of the things you could see throughout that spectacle was that it was a bunch of men, first of all, and the idea of the nation was very much hitched to this wagon of masculinity, And there's a kind of a martial idea of the nation that obviously within the first decade or two was exposed, right? And so people like Buche Mecheta, who begin to finger questions around gender and the nation and the project of independence becomes important. But the teacher says we were ready for big and beautiful things. And one of the other things he says that the promise was so beautiful, even those who were too young to understand it all knew that at last something good was being born. It was there. We were not deceived about that. There was no deception. I mean, the truth is that political independence had come and people could see it, right? And one of the things that Kwame Nkrumah often said as they were negotiating for independence in Ghana, he often invoked the Bible. There's a verse that says, seek ye the kingdom of God, and any avid Bible readers, seek ye the kingdom of God and everything else will follow. So he invokes that to say, seek ye the political kingdom. So for him, seeking the political kingdom was the ultimate priority of the fight for independence. And of course, after that, then what? What does the project of freedom itself entail? How do you populate it with more substance other than the political kingdom? I don't know whether South Africa's political history in the last 20 years has something to offer in terms of thinking about how political party cultures have kind of changed. And you have these parties that are now kind of fingering the cracks that are beyond the political kingdom, and they're offering themselves as, offering other kinds of freedom that are in fact very substantive for many people in the country, So, and again, I'm just quoting from Ngugi's A Grain of Wheat. Everybody waited for something to happen. This waiting and the uncertainty that went with it was a taut chord beneath the screams and the shouts and the laughter. And again, the juxtaposition of the rhetoric of nationalism and the actual project of decolonization, that tension. And one of the things that Frantz Fanon talks about in The Wretched of the Earth, in the chapter I was talking about yesterday, on the pitfalls of national consciousness was that there's a difference between the project of nationalism, which many of these political leaders were coming with at that moment of independence, as opposed to that of national liberation. And he theorized extensively between those two. And it doesn't mean that the political classes did not know about national liberation. They knew. But of course, they projected a different idea to this moment of freedom, which was obviously for their own benefit. And so he cautions against this too. And if you see part of what the man in Aikwe Oumas, the Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born is trying to do is to expose that fallacy, that nationalism is not necessarily national liberation. National liberation means it takes on a bigger group of people who are marginalized. It takes on a bigger, particularly economic freedom for this group of people. And so Aikwe Oumas and Ngugi wa Thiong'o were very much students of Fanon at the time. And this idea of a kind of a parasitic national bourgeoisie that really just feeds on the nation and it accumulates wealth as opposed to creating wealth. If you read Ngugi's novel, Devil on the Cross, which came after A Grain of Wheat, it is clear that he's, in a very simple way, really trying to say that the political class is a bunch of thieves and robbers. And the language in the novel, if you read, is quite shocking. He talks about thieves and robbers in the cave, and he refers to them as such. And of course, he wrote the novel while in detention, and there are all sorts of things that were going on at the time. So again, Fanon becomes an important scaffolding for reading Aikwe Oumas. So one of the things, if you're looking at the generations of African literature, Oumas is always read as a writer who embodies the literature of disillusionment in the continent, and particularly The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. It's a text that is often cited as one that gives life to this idea of the literature of disillusionment. And as I pointed out, again, some of Aikwe Oumas' contemporaries were also at different points of their authorial lives trying to grapple with this moment of disillusionment. And I gave you the example of Peter Abrahams, and I'm just giving quotes from different writers who were talking about this moment of independence. So Oumas, for instance, called it equilibrating political arrangement. Achebe calls it a great collusive swindle. And then Ama Ata Aidu, the author from Ghana, calls it a dance of the masquerades called independence. And Ngugi obviously calls it just flag independence. It doesn't go beyond that. So there's a whole range of ways of trying to find a grammar to express this disillusionment and this despair. And various writers took different narrative modes to try and engage with that. Another critic by the name Biodun Jaifo calls it arrested decolonization. And there are different strategies that different writers use. We spoke about allegory and irony yesterday. Ngugi is particularly fond of allegory. And again, we see in Aikwe Oumas, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, there's a section where the teacher is talking to the man, and he brings up, those of you who are students of philosophy, brings up Plato's allegory of the cave. Do we know about Plato's allegory of the cave? And he talks extensively about people sitting in a cave and looking at their shadows on the wall, as opposed to seeing the real light outside. And the person who's seen the real light outside comes into the cave, and they think this person is mad, when this person tries to tell them that, in fact, the shadows you're seeing, there's real light outside. And so that allegory of the cave then becomes an interesting kind of symbol for the teacher. Now, if you're thinking about the actual text itself, these are the main characters. The man, he's given a very kind of, he's not given any specific name, it's just called the man, and his wife Oyo, and there's a Kumsun, who's supposed to be a politician, right? I don't know how many people have started reading the novel. Kumsun is supposed to be the politician, and his wife Estella, and then of course there's the teacher. And the man and Oyo have, I think, 2 or 3 kids. And so this is the major cast in the novel. And each of these characters kind of come in as a kind of a metaphor for a whole range of things. But what we see in the novel is a bleak material universe. The man is walking around, and he walks around the city, and he can see the decay, the filth. He's riding in the bus. I mean, the first chapter, I don't know what you made of it, when I first read the novel and I read the first chapter, there was something quite visceral about it, and also very funny. I don't know what your experience of reading the first chapter was. I think it really frames the entire project of the novel. The man in the bus and the conductor who's smelling the money, and then his reaction to the man sleeping in the bus, and he's drooling all over, and it's a very, very excremental narrative. And then, of course, the banister. Do you remember when the man goes to the office and I think the first time I read, I stopped touching any banisters when I go up there, because then this narrative is always in my head, and it's interesting the way he uses material culture, the construction, the architecture. He uses most of these things as kind of metaphors for a whole range of. So the banister becomes this symbol of decay, years upon years of decay, and there's a kind of a moral crisis that emerges out of that bleak material universe. So it's a very visceral text, eh? I don't know how you felt, and you can smell certain things when you read the novel. You can hear. It's a very very ocular, very various forms of imagery that our senses are supposed to apprehend. So there's this idea of a bleak material universe versus the impossible project of moral regeneration on the part of the man. And I'm just putting out a quote there by Neil Lazarus, who says that the novel is formulated upon the premise that it is only by knowing one's world, by seeing it for what it is, that one can ever genuinely aspire to bring about its revolutionary transformation. I mean, one of the things that Steve Biko talks about is exactly that knowledge of the self is a primary departure point for any project of revolution. I don't know if you know the South African author Njabulo Ndebele, who was once the Vice Chancellor of UCT. He wrote a collection of short stories called Fools and Other Stories. I don't know if any of you have read it. And he was offering an alternative way of engaging with anti-apartheid, at least in my opinion, which was very much part of building on black consciousness, in saying that one has to go back to the everyday. One has to go back to how does one live and love and eat? How does one, in their everyday ecosystemic lives, how does one apprehend that? Is one comfortable with that? And only at that point can one then carry out a sustainable revolutionary practice. And he's one of the really interesting people in terms of shifting ideas around freedom in South Africa. After 1994, I think there was something very prophetic about some of the things he writes about in that collection of short stories. And of course, building on Biko's ideas around knowledge of the self. So that one can make all of these connections. Really, that's the point I'm trying to say. So if you can allow me to just kind of go through some passages in the novel, just to excavate what we've been talking about. We are told that the new world is embedded in the old in the novel. Let me just go to one of the excerpts in the novel. There's a passage here that I am interested in, where the man is walking. I think he's walking to work. Yes. And in the last paragraph on page 9, we are told that the man moved a little less slowly now, keeping to the dark earth beside the gutter that ran the length of the road. He passed by the gloomy building of the post office, and his pace quickened involuntarily as he began descending the steep little hill beyond that. Across the road, at the bottom, the street lamps perfunctorily gave a sudden illumination of the shapes of the row of old commercial buildings, and their light bounced dully off the corrugated iron shelters in front of the shop gates beneath which the watchman slept. And then you've got all those acronyms. He passed by the UTC, the GNTC, the UAC, and the French CFAO. The shops had been there all the time, as far back as he could remember. The GNTC, of course, was regarded as a new thing, but only the name had really changed with independence. The shop had always been there, and in the old days, it had belonged to a rich Greek and was known by his name A.G. Leventis. So in a way, the thing was new. I mean, that's really satirical. It's very... Yet the stories that were sometimes hard about it were not stories of something young and vigorous, but the same old stories of money changing hands and throats getting moistened and palms getting greased. Only this time, if the old stories aroused any anger, there was nowhere for it to go. The sons of the nation were now in charge, and it's an indictment. The sons of the nation were now in charge, after all. How completely the new thing took after the old. The sons of the nation. And again, it's that kind of genealogical narrative. So that paragraph for me captures very clearly that, there's nothing new in the new. And of course, we are told that it was simply a change of embezzlers. People who had embezzled before, and a new generation of embezzlers. The colonialists and a new generation of neo-colonialists. And the idea of Nkrumah and his party, because Nkrumah's party obviously came into power and it promised all these things, and the party was seen as the route to economic freedom. And I mean, I don't know if there's some deja vu in South Africa at the moment. The idea that the party is your mother and your father, it will provide for you. And there are all these ideas that were from, Stalinist Russia, from the early 20th century, from, ideas around political parties and the state and strong states, and that then became grounds in which various forms of patronage began to build themselves around. So there's a passage around Nkrumah's party. Often when I think about political parties now, I wonder whether much has changed, because how do you explain the rise of Trump? In a country where, well, I guess he comes from this idea that he's not in any kind of conservative political party, which is quite weird. So I just think that we need a new kind of politics. I don't know how it's going to be organized, in which platform, but political parties are just. So on page 62, you're told that this is the teacher. This is a conversation that the teacher is having with a man. He says, "Why do we waste so much time with sorrow and pity for ourselves? It is true now that we are men, but not so long ago. We were helpless messes of soft flesh and unformed bone, squeezing through bursting mother holes, trailing dung and exhausted blood." And again, there's a lot of this kind of imagery throughout the novel. "We could not ask then why it was necessary for us also to grow. So why now should we be shaking our head and wondering bitterly why they are children together with the old, why time does not stop when we ourselves have come to stations where we would like to rest? It is so like a child to wish all movement to cease. And yet the wondering and the shaking and the vomiting horror is not all from the inward sickness of the individual soul. Here we have had a kind of movement that should make even good stomachs go sick. What is painful to the thinking mind is not the movement itself, but the dizzying speed of it. It is that which has been horrible, unnatural, I would have said, had I not stopped myself with asking unnatural according to what kind of nature? When people talk about truth now, in the post-Trump, what is truth, what is fact, what is news, what is not news? Each movement and each growth, each such thing brings with itself its own nature to frustrate our future judgment. Now, whenever I'm able to look past the beauty of the first days, the days of birth, I can see growth. I tell myself that is the way it should be. There is nothing that should break the heart in the progressive movement away from the beauty of the first days. I see growth. That is all I see within my mind. When I can only see, when there is nothing I can feel, I'm not troubled. But always these unwanted feelings will come in the end and disturb the tired mind with thoughts that will not go away. How horribly rapid everything has been, from the days when men were not ashamed to talk of souls of suffering and hope, to those low days of smiles that will never again be sly enough to hide the knowledge of betrayal and deceit. Again, from Ngugi's A Grain of Wheat, we see these kind of enduring themes about betrayal and deceit and a moral crisis engendered by these different parties. We are told that Nkrumah's party has come full circle. If you read the next page, he talks about a man-child, like the idea of the nation as a child that is born and within 10 years it's grown old and it's decayed. So he's talking about the man-child and going full circle in a very short period of time. All of these interesting symbologies. And again, the idea of, I remember I said yesterday, Ben Okri, the Nigerian author, talks about, in one of his novels called The Famished Road, he talks about Nigeria in the 80s as the Abiku child, the child that keeps coming and going. If I can quickly contextualize, the Abiku is the idea of Abiku child comes from the idea of a spirit child, that their children were born to die. And they're born and they die and they come to torment the mother. So it's a whole kind of cultural thing in some parts of Nigeria. If you remember in Things Fall Apart, Okonkwo's daughter, Ezinma, she was an Ogbanje. In Igbo they call it Ogbanje. In Yoruba they call it Abiku, the child who goes and comes back again. And so Ben Okri was using that to refer to these cycles of military coups. And this nation that is born, it dies, born and it dies, like constantly going through a full circle before it actually achieves its full potential in that regard. And so the teacher goes back to that image of the man-child. And the idea of black skin, white masks. Frantz Fanon's book called Black Skin, White Masks, and this idea of replacing the old masters with new masters. Again, page 126 has a passage that speaks to that. If I can just quickly go there. Yeah, and this was quite funny because the man, at this point, the man and his wife are going to visit the politician Estela, Kumsun and Estela. They're going to visit them. And so they're going to visit them in their neighborhood. And so the man is thinking about the names that are all over that neighborhood. And he says here that not everything was entirely the same, though. Here and there, the names had changed. True, there were very few black names of black men, but the plates by the roadside had enough names of black men with white souls, and names trying mightily to be white. In the forest of white men's names, there were the signs that said almost aloud, "Here lives a black imitator." Mills Hayford, I can't even pronounce those names, Plenge Bannerman, Arthur White, Kuntu Blankson, others that must have been keeping the white neighbors laughing even harder in their homes. Akromond. What Ghanaian name could that have been in the beginning, before its civil servant owner rushed to civilize it, giving it something like the sound of a master name? Grandson. More and more incredibly they were getting. There was someone calling himself Fentengson in this wide world, and also a man called Binful. Another black push baby person. He's reflecting on this, and the man has a very acute sense of humor. And so these passages kind of speak to kind of Ouma's project of deconstructing this thing called independence. And throughout the novel, there's a kind of the moral intelligence of the man himself, obviously built around Ouma's authorial voice. And of course, I'm just kind of going back to, Fanon's chapter on the pitfalls of national consciousness, and the idea of a national bourgeoisie as simply a group of people who want to consume and to show other people that they are consuming. And throughout the novel, we see Kumsun, the politician, and his wife. And when the man visits Kumsun and his wife at their home, there are all of these kind of very expensive things in the house, and he's reflecting on how that happens when, masses of other people are living in poverty and all that, and this idea that arriving means being able to accumulate as much as one can, cars and all of that. And so the one sustained metaphor in the novel is that of the gleam. There's something about the gleam, which is represented by this hotel in the city called the Atlantic Caprice. As you can tell from the name, something capricious. What does something capricious do? And there's an interesting passage where he, on page 10, where he's describing the Atlantic caprice. Is it on page 10? I'm not sure. Oh yeah, here. I think this paragraph. It says, behind the farms, the dim mass of Yensua Hill rose from the ground, where its form ended. It was now possible to see the sky, still dark, but not so dark as the earth beneath. On top of the hill, commanding it just as it commanded the scene below, its sheer, flat, multi-storied side, an insulting white in the concentrated gleam of the hotel's spotlights, towered the useless structure of the Atlantic caprice. Sometimes it seemed as if the huge building had been put there for a purpose, like that of attracting itself to itself all the massive anger of a people in pain. But then, if there were any angry ones at all these days, they were most certainly feeling the loneliness of mourners at a festival of crazy joy. Perhaps then the purpose of this white thing was to draw onto itself the love of a people hungry for just something such as this. The gleam, in moments of honesty, had a power to produce a disturbing ambiguity within. It would be good to say that the gleam never did attract. It would be good, but it would be far from the truth. And something terrible was happening as time went on. It was getting harder to tell whether the gleam repelled more than it attracted more than it repelled, or just did both at once in one disgustingly confused feeling all the time these heavy days. So that's where Ouma's metaphor, or this idea of the gleam, begins to take shape. And it's a kind of a sustained metaphor in the novel across different passages. And there's this kind of emerging idea of a false consciousness, that you've seen the light, and that for you to arrive, you are in the gleam of arrival. And all of that is kind of mixed with the man's ambiguity towards material things, towards the idea of consumption, which has taken over this society, that for you to be respected and to be seen as an honorable member of the society, you will have consumed, you will have accumulated certain things, and that you will, and these things will always be gleaming, whether it's the cars that you drive that are fast and they are clean and they are, you know. So there's a whole kind of existential narrative around the gleam that is going on. And there's a passage which I'm calling taking the leap of fraud, that for you to be able to transcend your material conditions, you've got to defraud the system. It's the only way for you to bridge that gap. If you remember in the novel, within the first 2 chapters, when the man is in the office, somebody comes and wants to offer him a bribe, right? And then he refuses to take the bribe. And he goes back home to his wife, and his wife says, "Don't you like the things that Kumsun and Estella have? Why didn't you accept the bribe?" But of course, that is not the principle for the man. And so there are interesting passages where this idea of the gleam begins to unfold as a metaphor, an extended metaphor. And there are sections where the author, in fact, offers other alternative ideas of a gleam or attraction or wealth, which is quite interesting. So there's the leap of fraud, and there's an analogy of insects and a street lamp. There's a street lamp, and all these insects are attracted to it. Obviously, we know that the street lamp is not natural light. It's not sustainable light. It's going to be switched off, and then the next thing, what happens? So there are all these kind of parallel metaphors around this idea of the gleam. Just the final passage I'm going to read is, the man looks at himself, he looks around him, and he looks at his family, looks at his work, where he works. He works for the government. He thinks about his experiences across all of these official and intimate spaces. And he considers himself as a kind of an island, right? He considers himself as an island in a vast land of corruption and decay. And so he offers this interesting passage where he's sitting on the bridge, right? And I'm just going to read it to you now. Is it here? Wait a minute. I might have lost that passage. I think I lost it. Sorry. But he's sitting on a bridge at some point, and he's looking at the river is flowing.